Hello everyone and welcome to this lectures on Introduction to Modernism. So I would be discussing the second chapter and that would basically be the introduction. So this is how the second chapter is divided. It's divided into 3 lessons. The first one is titled in just introduction. The second lesson is titled as words, modernism, modernity and postmodernism. And as the title of the lesson suggests, we would be basically looking at the differences between these 3 words, that's modernism, modernity and postmodernism. And the final lesson is titled Modernism and Literature. So here we would be looking at the influence of the movement modernism on literature. So before I could actually begin discussing about modernism, I would like to draw your attention to things that probably happened some 50 years ago or also maybe some 100 years back. Now I would wish you all to think of certain things, like for example the kind of fashion that people followed, the kind of literature that was produced, the kind of music that was composed and consumed by people, the kind of fiction that was written, the kind of philosophy, and the way people followed their religion, all these things. And I'm sure all of you would have some idea of how these things were followed then. Now think of all these things that I spoke to you in the current times, the kind of fashion that we follow, the kind of music that is composed and consumed by us, the kind of dance forms that are innovated, the kind of literature that is produced, the importance of science, the importance of religion and such other things. I'm sure you will all agree with me that there's a huge difference between the times that I told you earlier and the current times. Now the question arises as to why am I asking you all to think about this same things at 2 different points of time. Now here is the context which led to the emergence of modernism. Now what was the reason as to why modernism emerged? So this is a possibility because of human tendency, and in both ways. One, it's very natural for humans to get bored with whatever is old. Second, it's human craving to always look for something new, to look for something fresh. And therefore, especially the modernists attempted to make things new, to at least make things appear new and look fresh. Now this is how Rosenberg, one of the scholars, modernist scholars, would go on to define modernism as a tradition of the new. Now what was this tradition? They tried to make things appear or look new. Now if modernism was trying to make things appear new or appear fresh or appear different, then I'm sure there is something that was there which they opposed. Now a school that preceded modernism is called realism, and that's extremely important for us to understand modernism. If we need to understand modernism, then it's very important for us to understand realism. Now what were the tenets of realism? What was the foundations of realism? What are the basic principles on which realism stood? Now realism, it tried to objectively depict the world with no cultural or ideological constraints. So they looked around themselves and depicted it in their arts, or they narrated things as they occurred, as they saw it occurring in their lives. So therefore, for them, for realists, literature was nothing but the mirror to the society, without taking into consideration the cultural constraints, the ideological constraints of humans, or these are very powerful tools which actually go on to form human beings. Now, therefore, because they believed to represent whatever happened in the world and as it appeared, they modeled their arts on history and journalism. And I'm sure all of us do know that history and journalism, the base of both of this subject lies in facts. You cannot have fictional history, neither can you have fictional journalism. They're supposed to be doing factual checks and supposed to give us the truth, unlike the times that we see around us today. So, therefore, there was nothing that was added to the truth, there was nothing that was subtracted from the truth. So, they tried to present only the truth, and that was realism for us. Now, realism in itself was also a new school when it actually appeared, because that was the first school which actually gave us a template for fiction writing. Now, fiction writing in itself started in 1741 when a novel titled Pamela was published, and it was written by a person named Samuel Richardson. Now, you had number of other promoters of realism like Daniel Defoe, who wrote that very interesting novel titled Robinson Crusoe. You had others, Smollett, you had Henry Fielding. These are also called the four wheels of novel or fiction writing. Now, how did modernism place itself against realism? Or what were the tenets of modernism which did not fall in line with realism? Realism said they represented the world as it appeared to them or as it occurred to them, whereas modernism said they had alternative ways or modes of representing the world. It was not necessary to represent the world as it appeared, but you had many different ways of making things appear look new and fresh and then represented. Now, before we could get into the origins and the end of modernism, it's important to understand that modernism was an all-inclusive movement. Now, what do I mean by all-inclusive movement? Modernism was not a movement in literature alone, but included all other aspects, all other areas. It ventured into almost everything, every area of a human being. For example, it ventured into music, it ventured into dance, it ventured into fashion, it ventured into paintings, ventured into literature, name it, and you had modernism. And that's what I mean by saying it was all-inclusive movement. Now, the name that is collectively given to all the movements in the field of music, in the field of painting, in the field of literature, in the field of political science and all this, it's called avant-garde movements. Now, avant-garde movements is a name that is given to the movements that come under the umbrella called modernism. Now, what did Ezra Pound, another scholar, modernist scholar, say? He said the modernists struggled to make it look new. I'm sure what he meant, we understand it to the core, because we all understand and know how difficult it is to make common things look fresh, or to make common things look new, or to present common things in a very different manner. Now, what happened? Because of the attempt of the modernists to make every common thing look new and fresh, their works were extremely difficult. They made their works abstract, and because of which even today the works of the modernists appear to be extremely difficult to understand. An average reader finds no connections between the works of modernists, and therefore it's extremely important for us to understand the background against which they produce their works of art, be it literature or otherwise. Now, where do we get to hear of the word modernism for the first time? It appeared in the work produced by Robert Graves and Laura Riding, and the title of the book was a survey of modernist poetry. It was published in 1927. So that was the first time the word modernism was used to refer to a movement. I am sure the word modernism was otherwise used even before that, but as a reference to a movement in arts, that was the first time the word modernism was used. Now let me draw your attention to the beginning, origin and the end of this movement called modernism. Now the beginning and the end are both debatable, because some scholars would say modernism started in 1890s and continues till 1930s. But whereas there are equal number of scholars who would say modernism started much before that and continues even to this day. Like Jürgen Habermas, an important scholar and a philosopher, would say that the project of modernism still continues, and he believes that the movement called modernism hasn't got over yet. So therefore, you cannot have consensus with regard to neither the beginning nor the end of this movement in arts. So therefore, it's a debatable question, and the debate continues to happen to this day as well. Now let me bring to your notice few representatives from different areas into which modernism actually ventured into. In the field of literature, we have Virginia Woolf, who immensely contributed to literature. We also have James Joyce, whose popular book Ulysses is considered a path-breaking work. To come to India, we have Mulk Raj Anand, who wrote a book titled Untouchables, which was also highly appreciated for the kind of narrative style that he uses, and especially for the technique of stream of consciousness. In the field of painting, we have Picasso and also Kandinsky, who did remarkable work and contributed to this movement of modernism. In the field of science, we have Einstein, who came up with the theory of relativity and changed forever the notions of time and space. In the field of philosophy, we have Nietzsche, a philosopher who redefined the notion of the existence of God, and many other areas. We could go into fashion, we could go into music. We have Stravinsky, who composed The Rite of Spring, depicting human sacrifice, and like many others, we could go on discussing about modernism. So you had various modernists there. Now to conclude, I would just summarize what we have done so far and then take your leave. In the first place, we have looked at what exactly modernism is, how modernism emerged. It emerged in the background of realism. Realism was a school which tried to represent the world as it appeared to them. Now, how did modernism differ from realists? Modernists said we have alternative modes of representing the world, and that's how they differed. Secondly, I also told you modernism was an all-inclusive movement. It was not restricted to literature alone, but to every other field. It ventured into everything almost. And then I also told you about how the word modernism came about and how it was when it was used for the first time. And next, I discussed a little about the beginning and the end of modernism, which is highly debatable. And finally, spoke to you about the few representatives from few areas like painting, literature, philosophy, and science. So that's what we looked at in the first lesson, and thank you.